In the final desperate hours of a winter's night, in the year of our Lord 1457, the stone corridors of Pembroke Castle do not echo with the sounds of war. They are filled with something far more primal. The sound is a blade of pure agony slicing through the howl of the Atlantic gale. It is the scream of a child. Inside a chamber, heavy tapestries drink the flickering candlelight, doing little to stop the penetrating cold. This is not a royal apartment, it is a crucible, and in its center, on a bed soaked in blood and sweat, a 13-year-old girl is being torn apart. Her name is Lady Margaret Beaufort. Her small body, not yet a woman's, convulses against the sheets. Her bones, still growing, are being asked to perform a task for which they were never designed. The midwives, their faces grim in the dancing shadows, whisper prayers in Latin. Their words a desperate shield against the palpable presence of death in the room. Outside, snow falls on the frozen earth of Wales. But inside this room, the future of England is being born in a torrent of blood and suffering. This is the story you think you know. The story of the child mother who gave birth to Henry Tudor, the man who would end the Wars of the Roses and found a dynasty. But that is merely the consequence. The true story lies deeper, in the permanent, searing trauma of this moment. For what happened in this chamber did not just create a king, it annihilated a child, and from her ashes forged a woman of such terrifying, calculating will that she would bend the future of a nation to her command. This is the forgotten, horrific story of how a girl's agony became a kingdom's salvation. To understand the woman who would become the most powerful matriarch in English history, we must first understand the girl and the perilous inheritance that flowed through her veins. Lady Margaret Beaufort was born into the twilight of the 100 Years' War in May of 1443, a world where the web of lineage was both a fortress and a cage. She carried the blood of kings, a direct descendant of the great John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of the mighty Edward III. But royal blood, in the savage political landscape of 15th century England, was a volatile substance. The Beaufort line, specifically, was both exalted and tainted. It stemmed from Gaunt's long-term mistress, Catherine Swynford, whose children were only legitimised late in life by an Act of Parliament, an act which explicitly, and perhaps ambiguously, barred them from the throne. This single, festering detail meant that Margaret's blood was royal enough to make her a target, but not quite royal enough to make her safe. She was born a pawn in a game whose rules were written in blood. Her life of uncertainty began when she was barely a year old. Her father, John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, returned from the wars in France a broken man. He had commanded English forces during the humiliating final phases of the conflict, watching as the vast territories won by Henry V slipped through his fingers like sand. The shame consumed him. Courtiers who had known him as a proud commander now saw a man with hollow eyes and trembling hands, a ghost haunted by the spectre of his own failure. In May of 1444, he was found dead. The official cause was a sudden fever, but no one believed it. Whispers of poison slithered through the court as they always did. But a darker, more potent rumor clung to his memory: suicide. We cannot overstate the psychological weight of this legacy on the young Margaret. In a world governed by an unshakable faith, suicide was the ultimate sin, a final act of despair that damned the soul to eternal hellfire. To be the daughter of such a man was to be stained by his disgrace. This shadow may well have been the seed of her own extraordinary, almost obsessive piety in later life. It was not merely devotion, it was a lifelong, desperate negotiation with God, a relentless effort to purify her family's name, to prove that the blood of Beaufort was not cursed but chosen. Her father's failure would be redeemed by her son's triumph. Her father's perceived spiritual weakness would be counteracted by her own ironclad faith. With her father gone, Margaret's life ceased to be her own. She became a ward of the crown, which is to say she became property. The legal framework of 15th century wardship was brutally pragmatic. An orphaned heiress did not simply inherit her father's lands. Control of her person and her estates reverted to the king, to be managed or more often to be sold. Margaret, a toddler with a vast inheritance, was one of the most valuable commodities in England. Her guardian, the man who purchased her wardship, would control her wealth and, most importantly, possessed the absolute right to arrange her marriage. She was a human title deed, a vessel for the transfer of power. Her first guardian, William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, wasted no time. By the age of 6, she was formally betrothed to his son, John de la Pole. The contract was meant to bind two of England's most powerful families. But in a kingdom sliding towards civil war, alliances were built on shifting sands. In 1450, Suffolk fell from grace, blamed for the final loss of Normandy. His end was a grim preview of the brutality to come. Exiled, his ship was intercepted in the English Channel. He was dragged into a small boat, subjected to a mock trial, and beheaded with half a dozen clumsy blows from a rusty sword. The marriage contract was now worthless paper. The little girl, not yet 7 years old, had learned a vital lesson. In the world she inhabited, men, even powerful men, could be erased overnight. Survival required a different kind of strength. Margaret's wardship was transferred, this time into the hands of the king himself, Henry VI, and the king gave her to his own half-brothers, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. The Tudors were a strange and controversial presence at the English court. Their father, a Welsh squire named Owen Tudor, had secretly married Catherine of Valois, the widow of the great warrior king, Henry V. The union was a scandal, and the legitimacy of their sons was whispered about in every great hall in the kingdom. But they had one asset that trumped all others: the king's unwavering favour. Henry VI, a gentle and pious man ill-suited to his savage era, adored his half-brothers, elevating them to the earldoms of Richmond and Pembroke. To secure their future, Edmund the elder needed a bride with wealth and royal blood. The child Margaret Beaufort was the perfect choice. In 1455, at the age of 12, Margaret was married to 24-year-old Edmund Tudor. The ceremony at Bletsoe Castle sealed a political alliance with vows she could barely have understood. We must pause here and try to imagine this moment, not as a historical footnote but as a human reality. Imagine the cultural chasm between them. Margaret, a product of the English nobility, raised in a world of intricate courtly manners. Edmund, a Welshman at heart, a man whose family was seen by many as uncouth upstarts, more comfortable in the saddle on the wild Welsh marches than in the perfumed chambers of the court. Was there any tenderness in their brief union, any flicker of kindness from this seasoned man of war towards the child who was now his wife? The chronicles are silent. They record the political fact of the marriage, but not the trembling reality of the wedding night. The marriage was consummated immediately. There was no concept of waiting for physical maturity. A noble girl's duty was to produce an heir, and that duty began the moment the vows were spoken. For Margaret, this was the first great physical and psychological trauma of her life, a violent initiation into a world where her body was not her own, but an instrument for the ambitions of men. And within months that instrument was put to use. Her body began to change in ways that must have terrified her. The older women in her household would have spoken in hushed tones. Their joy at a potential heir mingled with a deep, unspoken fear for a mother so young. Margaret's own mother, who had been a mature 18 at her birth, watched her daughter's swelling belly with an anxiety that bordered on panic. She knew what the men who had arranged this union refused to acknowledge, that nature had its own laws, and they were about to be broken. But Edmund Tudor would never see his child. The Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that had been simmering for decades, finally erupted into open flame. The First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 had drawn the battle lines between the House of Lancaster, represented by the weak King Henry VI, and the House of York, led by the ambitious Richard, Duke of York. Edmund, as the king's half-brother, was a key Lancastrian commander. In the autumn of 1456, while campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured. The circumstances of his death are wrapped in the fog of war and propaganda. The official story, promoted by his Yorkist captors, the powerful Herbert family, was that he died of the plague in his prison at Carmarthen Castle. It was a convenient explanation. Disease was rampant in medieval prisons, and it absolved them of the crime of murdering a member of the royal family. But the speed of his decline was suspicious. Requests for physicians to attend him were denied. It is just as likely, if not more so, that he was deliberately killed. A political assassination designed to weaken the Lancastrian leadership in Wales. Whether by microbe or by blade, the result was the same. In November 1456, Edmund Tudor was dead. The news reached Margaret at Lamphy Palace. A messenger, his horse lathered in sweat, arrived on a rain-lashed evening and found her in the chapel, praying for her husband's safe return. Before he even spoke, she knew. At 13 years old, she was a widow, 7 months pregnant, and utterly alone in a kingdom that was tearing itself apart. The future of the Tudor line, and a significant branch of the Lancastrian claim, now rested entirely on the child trapped inside the body of a child. In the terrifying vacuum left by Edmund's death, one man stepped forward, his younger brother Jasper Tudor. The decision was born of both chivalry and cold, hard pragmatism. Margaret carried the sole heir to his family's ambitions. Protecting her was paramount. He brought her to his own formidable stronghold, Pembroke Castle, a massive fortress perched on the Welsh coast. Its walls a shield against the growing chaos. The journey itself was an ordeal. It was the dead of winter and the roads were frozen, rutted tracks of mud. Margaret travelled in a horse-drawn litter, every jolt sending a shock of pain through her swollen, overburdened body. Inside the imposing walls of Pembroke she found safety, but not comfort. The castle was a military installation, built for survival, not solace. The wind, a constant, mournful presence from the Atlantic, whistled through every crack in the ancient stones. Ice formed on the inside of the chamber windows, and in this cold, grim fortress, Margaret's time came. On the 28th of January 1457, her labour began. What followed was not a birth. It was an 18-hour medieval torture session. The castle's physician, a learned man named Dr. Lewis Caerleon, had examined her with growing alarm. Her hips, he confided to Jasper, were too narrow. The child was large and poorly positioned. He knew with the certainty of his profession that this was likely to be fatal. Here in this birthing chamber, two worlds of medicine collided. Dr. Caerleon, with his university learning from Oxford and Paris, his knowledge of the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, represented the formal, male world of theoretical medicine. He understood the grim mechanics of the situation and could foresee the likely outcome. He could, in theory, perform a caesarean section. But this was not a life-saving procedure for the mother. It was a post-mortem act to retrieve the infant for baptism, and it was invariably fatal. The other world belonged to the midwives, led by a woman named Dame Gwyneth Dafydd. Her knowledge was not from books, but was passed down through generations of women. It was a practical, hands-on wisdom. She knew which herbs could ease pain, which prayers to whisper, which positions might encourage a reluctant child. They would have used a birthing girdle, a long scroll of parchment inscribed with prayers and holy names, wrapping it around Margaret's belly to invoke divine protection. They would have burned lavender to calm her and rosemary to give her strength. But as the hours dragged on, and Margaret's screams faded into exhausted animalistic gasps, both science and tradition were failing. Dame Gwyneth and Dr. Caerleon would have conferred in urgent, hushed tones. The baby was still alive, but its heartbeat was growing weak. Margaret was bleeding internally, her life slipping away. A terrible decision was made: manual extraction. It was a brutal, desperate procedure. The midwife would have to reach inside the young girl's body to try and turn the child and guide it out. It was an act that would almost certainly kill the mother, but it was the only remaining hope of saving the child. We cannot know the precise, horrific details of that final act, but we know its results. As dawn broke, the baby was finally torn from Margaret's body. The chamber fell silent, the only sound the crackling fire and Margaret's ragged, shallow breathing. The infant was pale, limp, and silent. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed both mother and child were lost. Then Dame Gwyneth, clearing the baby's mouth, slapped its back. A thin, furious wail cut through the air. Henry Tudor had arrived. Margaret, floating in a haze of pain and near death, heard that cry. She tried to reach for her son, but her limbs would not obey. The midwives placed the swaddled child on her chest for a fleeting moment before rushing him to the warmth of the fire. But the cost of that cry was catastrophic. Dr. Caerleon's examination in the following days confirmed the extent of the damage. The tearing was severe. The internal injuries would never fully heal. She was racked by fever and infection for weeks, hovering on the precipice of death. And she would never ever bear another child. At 13 years old, her reproductive life was over, sacrificed on the altar of her son's birth. This event must be understood as a profound psychological schism. This was the moment Margaret Beaufort the girl died, and Margaret the strategist was born. Her body was broken, but her will was forged into something harder than steel. Her inability to have more children meant that this one, single son, born of such agony, now represented her entire purpose for being. All her faith, all her intelligence, all her formidable energy would be channeled into one singular obsessive goal: seeing that son upon the throne of England. Her intense piety, which had begun as a way to process the shame of her father, now deepened into a covenant with God. She had been spared, she must have believed, for a reason. She had endured a crucifixion of the flesh, and her son would be the resurrection of her family's hopes. The pain had given her a purpose, as vast and as relentless as the sea that crashed against the cliffs below. In the wake of the Lancastrian cause's catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Towton in 1461, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, Margaret's world was upended. The Lancastrian king, Henry VI, was a fugitive, and a Yorkist, Edward IV, sat on the throne. Margaret, with her Lancastrian blood and her infant son who carried a sliver of a royal claim, was in mortal danger. Survival in this new hostile world required a mind of breathtaking pragmatism, and so in 1458, barely recovered from a childbirth that had nearly killed her, she married again. Her choice of husband was a masterstroke of political calculation. She married Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the powerful Duke of Buckingham. Crucially, the Staffords were Yorkist sympathizers. The marriage was a shield. It was an act of public acquiescence to the new regime, a way to protect her lands and, more importantly, her son. It was a loveless political arrangement, a business partnership where the primary asset was survival. Imagine the immense self-control this required. To share a bed with a man whose political loyalties were pledged to the enemies of her house, to smile at a court that had deposed her king, all while secretly nurturing the flame of her son's claim. The most painful provision of this new life was the separation from Henry. For his own safety, the boy remained in Wales, under the guardianship of his steadfast uncle, Jasper Tudor. For the next 14 years, Margaret would live as a mother in exile from her own child. She saw him perhaps once or twice a year, brief, carefully negotiated visits. He grew from an infant to a boy to a young man, largely a stranger to her. Her frustrated maternal love was channeled into a new, more dangerous form of communication. She built a network of trusted servants and priests who ferried messages back and forth. Letters written in code, with news and maternal advice hidden within seemingly innocuous passages about estate management or scripture. This separation was a constant, dull ache in her life, but it focused her ambition with razor-sharp clarity. If she could not raise her son, she would raise him to the throne. She learned to play the long game, cultivating relationships with astonishing diplomatic skill. She maintained a cordial, even friendly correspondence with the Yorkist queen, Elizabeth Woodville. This was the invisible court of 15th-century women. While their husbands and sons slaughtered each other on the battlefield, women like Margaret and Elizabeth built parallel networks of influence. They understood that kings could rise and fall, but the survival of their children and their family lands required a more subtle, more patient kind of politics. They were rivals, yes, but they were also mothers in a world that was ruthlessly hostile to the ambitions of women, and they understood each other on a level their husbands never could. Margaret was learning that true power was not always wielded with a sword. Sometimes it was wielded with a carefully worded letter, a well-placed spy, or a strategic marriage. The political landscape shifted again in 1471. After a brief, miraculous restoration, the Lancastrian cause was utterly destroyed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The Lancastrian heir, Prince Edward, was killed. King Henry VI himself was quietly murdered in the Tower of London shortly after. The direct Lancastrian line was extinct. Suddenly, Margaret's 14-year-old son, Henry Tudor, living in quiet obscurity in the Welsh hills, became, by virtue of his tainted but traceable Beaufort blood, the last best hope of the defeated Lancastrian faction. He went from being a political afterthought to being the most wanted man in England. Jasper Tudor, ever the pragmatist, knew that to remain in Wales meant certain death. In a hurried, desperate flight, he took the young Henry to a ship at Tenby and sailed into a 14-year exile in Brittany. Margaret received the news days later. Her son was gone. The Channel now separated them, a moat of salt water and political hostility. She had no way of knowing if she would ever see him again. The grief was immense, but it quickly calcified into something else, cold, unyielding resolve. Henry Stafford died in 1471, not long after her son's flight into exile. His death, whether from old war wounds or something more mysterious, freed Margaret from her Yorkist shield. Now, in her late 20s, twice widowed, she faced a critical choice. She could have retired to her estates, a wealthy dowager living a life of quiet piety. She chose power. In 1472, she made her third and final marriage, the most brilliant political maneuver of her life. She married Thomas, Lord Stanley. If Margaret was a master of patient strategy, Stanley was a grandmaster of opportunistic timing. His family, enormously powerful in the northwest of England, had a famous and often mocked motto, "Ja Stanley Ja." They specialized in waiting, in committing their forces to a battle only at the last possible moment when the winner was clear. To his many enemies, Stanley was a treacherous coward. To Margaret, he was the perfect ally. She didn't marry a man. She married his army, his political cunning, and his profound instinct for self-preservation. Their marriage was a union of two of the most politically astute minds in England. Their household must have been a fascinating, silent theatre of intrigue. It was a partnership built not on affection, but on a shared, unspoken understanding of the brutal mechanics of power. They would have respected each other's skills, even as they likely never fully trusted one another. Stanley provided Margaret with the cover and the resources to operate, while she gave him the prestige of her royal blood and access to her own considerable intelligence networks. For 11 years, they navigated the treacherous court of Edward IV. Margaret played the part of the pious, loyal wife, all while meticulously expanding her web of contacts. And then, in 1483, the event she had been waiting for her entire adult life occurred. Edward IV died suddenly, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as king. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power in a ruthless coup. The young king and his brother disappeared into the Tower of London, never to be seen again. Richard crowned himself King Richard III. The usurpation and the presumed murder of the princes in the Tower was a profound shock to the nation. It was a violation of the sacred laws of kinship and inheritance. And for Margaret, it was a gift from God. Richard's tyranny had shattered the legitimacy of the Yorkist claim. Suddenly, her son Henry's distant, complicated claim seemed a beacon of hope, a viable alternative to a child-murdering usurper. The time for waiting was over. The network she had spent 2 decades building was activated. Her spycraft, honed over years of secret communication with her exiled son, was now weaponized. It was a network built on plausible deniability. She used her personal physician to carry sensitive financial information, knowing that his travels would not arouse suspicion. She employed her confessor, a priest named Christopher Urswick, as a trusted courier, exploiting the sanctity of his office to move between conspirators. She worked in concert with another brilliant political mind, Bishop John Morton, who was himself in exile. Through Morton, she coordinated with the remnants of the old Lancastrian nobility and with disgruntled Yorkists who were appalled by Richard's actions. Money, intelligence, and pledges of support flowed across England and the Channel, all originating from the quiet, devout household of Lady Margaret Stanley. It was a conspiracy of breathtaking audacity, orchestrated by a woman who had learned the art of war not on a battlefield, but in a birthing chamber and through the agonizing silence of a mother's separation. An initial rebellion in 1483 failed, and Margaret was placed under house arrest, her titles stripped. But it was too late. The gears were in motion, and not even a king could stop them. In August of 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in Wales. the very same coastline where he had been born in trauma and from which he had fled as a boy. He had a small, unimpressive army of exiles and French mercenaries. By all military logic, his invasion was a fool's errand destined for failure. But he did not march with an army of soldiers alone. He marched with the invisible army his mother had built for him over 30 years, an army of promises, of secret loyalties, of carefully cultivated grievances against the king. The final act played out on a field near Market Bosworth on August 22nd. King Richard III had a larger, superior force. Positioned on a hill overlooking the battlefield was a third army, a formidable contingent of thousands of men, commanded by Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother William. Their intervention would be decisive. Richard III, knowing of his wife's plotting, held Stanley's son hostage to ensure his loyalty. He sent a message to Stanley, "Join the battle now or your son dies." Stanley's famously ambiguous reply was, "Sire, I have other sons." Imagine the tension of that moment, the culmination of Margaret's entire life. Her son's fate, her own life, the future of England, all rested on the character of the man she had married, a man whose defining feature was his calculated refusal to commit. Had her years of influence been enough to sway this ultimate pragmatist? Richard III, in a desperate final gamble, saw Henry Tudor's banner across the field and charged, hoping to end the battle with a single blow. As the king's personal retinue crashed into Henry's, the Stanleys finally made their move. Their forces, which Richard believed were his reserve, slammed into the flank of his army. It was not a battle, it was a betrayal, perfectly timed and ruthlessly executed. Richard III was cut down, fighting to the last. The crown of England was plucked from a thorn bush and placed upon the head of Henry Tudor. Margaret, waiting miles away, received the news. Her son was King Henry VII. After 14 years of exile and a lifetime of struggle, she had won. Her reunion with Henry was not the emotional embrace of a long-lost mother and child. It was something more complex, more formal. They were now partners in the great enterprise of the Tudor dynasty. She had not raised him, but she had made him. Her love was not expressed in lullabies and comfort, but in the delivery of a crown. She immediately assumed a title of unprecedented power, My Lady the King's Mother. She signed her name Margaret R., the R standing for Regina, Queen, a title she held in all but name. Margaret Beaufort lived for another 24 years, long enough to see her life's work come to fruition. She became the revered, formidable matriarch of the new Tudor court. She arranged the crucial marriage between her son and Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses, and finally bringing peace to a kingdom bled white by decades of civil war. She doted on her grandchildren, especially the robust young prince who would one day become the infamous Henry VIII. She was a patron of learning, a shrewd manager of her vast estates, and the most powerful woman in England. She died in 1509, just days after witnessing her grandson's coronation. Her purpose on earth finally and completely fulfilled. But the cost of this monumental achievement is almost impossible to calculate. To give England a king, she had sacrificed her body. To secure his throne, she had sacrificed the fundamental relationship of mother and child. She had traded personal happiness for dynastic immortality. The victory was absolute, but the scars never faded. In Westminster Abbey, you can see her tomb. Her effigy, cast in gilt bronze, lies upon a slab of black marble. The face is that of an old woman, pious and serene, her hands clasped in prayer. It is the image of the great stateswoman, the founder of a dynasty. But the tomb cannot tell the whole story. It cannot convey the chilling memory of a 13-year-old girl's body being broken. It cannot recapture the silent, unending grief of a mother separated from her only child for 14 years. And it cannot let you hear the echo of a scream that once filled a cold stone chamber in a Welsh castle. The scream of a child in agony, bringing forth the future of England, a sound that was both an ending and a beginning, buried now in the silence of history.